Hi there, Randy Green here. Let us continue. In the last podcast, I laid the foundation of our ancient history and the understanding of our solar system and its original purpose and function. Then 15,000 years ago, and of course, a lot of things happened there. And I can refer you to both the YouTube podcast series on the source of humanity, where I give 5 or 6 podcasts where I explain the background, the history of our solar system and what happened and the timeline event and whatnot, as well as the book, The Source of Humanity, including the whole Academy course material. So I don't feel any need to go any further into this here, because this is just summing it all up so you have an overview from where you begin to understand the complexity rate of what it means to truly understand what the UAPs are and what it is that it's not just about disclosure of, oh yeah, we got alien technology. Kind of all of us that are within this line of work, we know that. But the understanding is the purpose and function of this from a fifth cycle perspective to undo the effects of the already not successful fifth cycle that our solar system went through, including the timeline event. So that's kind of what we're here to do. That's not until we have solved that equation can we move on as part of the solar system. That's kind of our current limit of consciousness potentials. We reached so far, and then the timeline event happened, and we were pushed backwards in our progression cycles. So all of us that are now redoing the cycles, we are kind of forerunners that have already done it in previous run-throughs of the original civilizations of our solar system. So that's step 1. Step 2 is that none of the civilizations in our solar system, not even during the times of Atlantis, that were supposed to solve this conundrum, that were supposed to undo the effects of the timeline event to the degree, the peak, where we would flip naturally due to what we call emergence properties or feedback loop or synergetic effect into the original fifth cycle, from where we could then continue as a civilization and reunite with the original middle domain, fifth dimensional reality fields of existence. But we failed again, even though we had help from quote unquote humanoids from some of the other sectors that had succeeded their fifth cycle progression dynamics. But as they came into the Atlantean project and got in contact with the ancient technologies, as well as were influenced, to avoid a specific word here, I use a specific word in my books when that was okay to talk about that word, by these different code streams and the different configurations on these code streams, it altered their holographic energetic structure into the dysfunctional version of the fifth cycle and quickly began to fall back into the old patterns that led to the collapse of the fall of Atlantis. So in that manner, whenever we get in contact with the fifth dimension, even though we are trying to the best of our abilities, using all of the kindness potentials that we have learned as part of the fourth cycle and the understanding, the inclusivity, and really get the full capacity of recalibration, once we reach the fifth cycle, there is a lot of undone work there that different groups within our civilization never really reached, other than just in short glimpses within our joint history. That led all of the issues we have had here due to the timeline event, to just very, very shorten it up and just push us through enormous cycles of different groups and different choices and different distortions and different actions and different types of consciousness and different types of groups of civilizations and whatnot, led to the final colonization 15,000 years ago, where different groups, as part of the regressed lineages, that means the ones that were hit by the timeline event, reverted back into earlier versions of themselves within the different pillars as part of the original universal pillar project, because it's not just within a solar system or a systemic level. You have the pillar project, you have the large one that goes with the lineages. As they reverted and their councils reverted and decisions became more in alignment with the usage of the previous type of technology that were more focused on mind than on on consciousness, more focused on individual progression than actual joint progression, more focused on undoing the effects of the timeline event than actually looking at the effects of the reality field, but got more and more focused on the individual. The choices that were made on the council level reverted more and more into that we know best. This group knew better than that group. So the councils began to fight each other internally and externally amongst the other councils that were part of the governance of the different systemic reality fields that were the different, what we call collectives in the different dimensions. That means different lineages and their life forms and how they had unfolded within these sectors. And it all became this clashes of the species that began, instead of working together, they began to segregate. And that's what the regression does. It reverts to earlier stages that were similar to some of the issues we had in the previous universal cycles, which led to the joint decision of how we're going to run these universal cycles to reach our highest progression rate. With that, these different groups of the councils then began to override. Internal strife happened, discussion happened, and onward and so forth, ending up in what we could say certain groups that were stronger than other groups were because some of the, for instance, some of the humanoid lineages that had not fully blossomed into what we could call the 4-10 pillar, but only barely had learned how to be within the 3-9 pillar, that it means to administer the energy units of their reality field, they quickly regressed into the insectoid level and by that became easily controllable. The ones that had barely learned the dynamics of otherhood, these became the avian races that were segregating into different factions that were working more as in how do we preserve this faction as others against others instead of teaming up as with via inclusivity, teamed up in otherhood as against each other, as you are dissimilar from our group, hence you are not part of our group, and by that we begin to claim jurisdiction, we begin to claim jurisdictional rights, we begin to use our technology in a specific way. That's typically for the avian groups that work that way, unless they were aligned with other groups that were more, what we say, advanced in some of the council levels and onward and so forth. You begin to see how these different groups began to unfold different types of service to self features that were in alignment with their consciousness developmental level as well as the type of genetics they unfolded. And with that, we can begin to classify the different humanoid species as the insectoids, as the bottom of the hierarchy, the avians as the next group that goes into the otherness, which in our reality field became the foundation of the reseeding as part of the fourth cycle within the two clusters of collectives as we know as Mesopotamia and the original version of Egypt, which is not Egypt, but that whole continent after the fall of Atlantis. And we had the 3-9 pillar groups that technically turned into the reality field. And this is the interesting thing, because you say, well, isn't there some kind of group that represent that in terms of genetics? No, actually not, because the 3-9 pillars are always the reality fields as a structure. It's a hub where the different consciousness potentials can unfold. So we have 1728, that is the first step of all civilizations. Then they move into hubs that becomes test stations or work station within different types of reality field structures that are called pillar projects, where they can continue as working with that reality. And once they have mastered the dynamics of that reality, then they move into the next section of consciousness potentials that goes with the 410 pillar and the 511 pillar and the 612 pillar. So it's divided into sections. So you have the 17 and 28 that are part of the foundational consciousness structures, where you learn to organize yourself as an individual within a group, within what we call a sector. And then you go into a 3-9 where you learn to administer as part of the teamwork these different hubs, of which our solar system has one major hub, and that's our planet, that's Earth, that's the hub. where all these groups were supposed to, in the original reality field, to unfold what they have learned in the 1-7 and 2-8 pillar self and other dynamic groups to learn to do teamwork. Once they managed to or succeeded in that, they would move on to the next reality field, which had its fourth dimension in what we can look at the sky and say, that's Mars. But that's just the name we have given that star that no longer is a part of the original scheme, because once the colonization hit our reality field, the gate system, the portal into our solar system on that one was what we see as Mars. So that's technically, even though, it's a planet, well, that's what it became as it was absorbed into our solar system, that were re-engineered to hold mainly what we call previous cycle types of molecular crystalline structures of energies, where the different portals, instead of actually being fluxible and changeable reality fields that would be the rod inside our solar system, changed into what we understand as planets that had a spherical representation, because it's the third dimension. Third dimension turns portals that are multidimensional into spheres. Inside our reality field, the third dimension changes things either into geometry, crystalline, or into spheres. So that's another important thing to understand. So the sphere is the type. If you have a sphere, you have no beginning, you have no end. Things can progress and change and change form and change calibration. Whereas if it goes into the trinity or the geometrical forms, it crystallizes and then it gets stuck within specific timelines and can no longer alter and be modified. So this is also important. So if we have a trinity gate that is being created by some of the other groups that are working on the previous timelines, then the trinity structure is the one they can utilize to enter into our reality field. The trinity itself, as we know when we look at the pyramids, for instance, they are a pyramid that we see as a trinity structure, but technically it's a fourth dimensional because it has four sides and a platform that it rests upon. So it's a trinity structure that's capable of going into the fourth dimension, that has the foundation of lifting up into what we call the fifth cycle or the fifth dimension. So in an essence, if you say the trinity structure is kind of a triangular way where you can create a portal or a dense type of energy that goes into crystallization, it's stagnant, it stays in its configuration. Whereas once you turn it into a pyramid or a fourth dimensional, it can begin to vibrate in a way that can become a portal into the fourth dimension. And by that, link up to the different realities that were top of the original, that were part of the original fourth dimension, which we now classify that specific gate as the Martian gate, or the civilizations that existed on Mars. They had access and were originally calibrated for the fourth dimension. Portion of Mars, when that began to fall due to the timeline event reconfiguration, as in crystallizing and moving it backwards into its previous types of reality field configurations, which were clashed with the configurations of our solar system, then shifted some of these grids into the hub, that's the 3-9 pillar, that's our Earth, which then began to carry the different imprints of, as the timeline event crystallization began to take over our solar system, the viable hubs or the viable networks of the different reality fields that had their gate or their rod inside our solar system, the workstation they had inside our solar system, were transferred to our Earth. And by that, our Earth became the conglomerate of these different civilizations, these different pillars inside our solar system, then were seeded into our planet as a continuation of the original workstations that were part of the 1-7 pillar, 2-8 pillar, 4-10 pillar, 5-11 pillar, and 6-12 pillar. With that, we understand what is symbolically represented on our the dome of our reality field that is called the night sky. The 1-7 pillar is the first one is connected to Mercury, the second is to Venus, the third is our Earth, the fourth is Mars, the fifth is the asteroid belt, because the whatever was there of a reality field is now completely blown to pieces, and the sixth level is Jupiter. That's the inner planets technically that are connected to the inner levels of our solar system. What goes beyond there belongs to other reality fields, and in that way not of much interest. Well, does it mean that if we travel to Jupiter, we'll be able to connect to the original gate system of the sixth dimension? No, not at all. This is just a representation of reality fields that used to be there. The traveling must be higher dimensional. There, we can go as far as we want out into space. We will see nothing but previous cycles, energy units that are literally, yes, they are clustering up. Yes, they are accreting into quote unquote new stars, but we're seeing the processes of our universe as it is as part of the old cycles. Energy unit composition is that they dustify, they blow to pieces, and it expands into a vast space where the connection points between what has viability rate goes less and less. The distances become larger and larger until there's nothing but cold space, deep space with no viability rate, no configuration potentials, no progression potentials, and no consciousness potentials. Everything will revert into earlier versions of what was part of the previous universal cycles, that everything that was potential there was shifted into the current universal cycles, and by that are nothing but burned out or outdated holographic energetic units that no longer can carry consciousness potentials. And that's one of the reasons why the different civilizations that regress into the point where they no longer can have consciousness, as we understand with progression dynamics, to transform energy via the consciousness itself, then revert to technology, they revert to android forms, they revert to insectoid genetics that has a higher level of what we understand as previous universal cycles type of energy units that science within our reality field calls electromagnetic forces. With this, we begin to understand that electromagnetic energy and everything that science can classify using electromagnetic technology and paradigms and understandings are only, as they say, 4% of the known universe. That's all we know, 4%, because that aligns with electromagnetic energies and the laws of electromagnetic energies, whether it is general relativity or it's something else that the quantum sciences or whatever they know for now. It's all based upon the electromagnetic or the atomic forces, whether it's on the subatomic quantum level or it's the larger particles that they can measure, or it's into technology as we know of. This includes the biological form as we know of it. So this will be the foundation of the next podcast, where I will begin to explain some of the levels that we need to understand when we talk about what happened during the colonizations. Why did they take over? And I can give the answer to the why here. These different groups took over because they thought they could administer it better. These groups were part of the original councils, and they could see that they were beginning to regress to the point where they no longer could uphold what we could call consciousness potentials. We have the reptoids that turned into reptilians, they were original human-like, so they turned into reptilians. Then they began to regress even further, and eventually turning into what we know as some of the big groups of dinosaurs that we had on our planet. That's some of the early projects they dumped them here to play out the last stages of whatever they grew into, with very little consciousness and turning into pure mind as we understand it within a form that we now, and their original, what we could call higher order energy system began to calcify, turn into bones. Their higher order, what we call vibrational level, began to calcify and crystallized and turned into what we call the peripheral nervous system, and began to crystallize into the different organs that we understand that are driven by what we call electrochemical processes. Their consciousness or perception field began to regress into what we call the previous universal cycle type of mind that crystallized into a neural network that then began to create what we call electrochemical processes around it that became the glia cells, that became the fatty tissue that is around the neurons and onward and so forth. So the reptoids were the first that began to generate the features that we actually understand as an organic vessel. The insectoids, they went through the same processes, but since they are dissimilar to the rest of us, I explained some of this in the book Pterology, very foundational level technically. The avians, they are not birds as we understand. They had a different type of feature. They were working extensively with the rhabdoid avian issue on Mars, actually, because it's a fourth dimensional issue. And that's where we get the winged creatures as hybrids. And they began the hybrid projects to try and undo the regression, some of the civilizations that were there on Mars. And that's what led Mars to this full destruction. That reality field, the fourth dimensional original reality sector as part of our reality field, crumbled and fall due to these genetic experimentations. They were later on transferred to Earth, which then led to the fall of the fourth dimension inside the hub, inside the 3-9 pillar. Again, all of these are the history, part of our history, the failure of all the different things that have happened in our solar system. So we begin to understand that the takeaway from this is that the foundation of what we're doing now is that it's not just about activating and awakening into these different dimensions. It's just as much to go in and say, what can we learn from the original history, and what is it that we need to undo of the original history? What is it that we need to play out better? What choices is it that we need to do of what is left of the original reality field network and the original reality consciousness grid works that connects to the lineages? What are the original code systems that needs to be activated, and which one of the original code systems need to be evaporated and no longer take into use, so they no longer connect to the previous cycles and the outdated forms of consciousness potentials and the outdated forms of mind, and transfer it into the highest progression rate that is supposed to unfold within the solar system. So these are some of the choices that we are to make when we learn about ancient history. It's to learn from history. It's not to repeat the mistakes we've already done. These are some of the important aspects of the future of our civilization, that we need to undo certain choices we did in the past. That's part of our responsibility as individuals on our individual energy system timeline work, when we work with our template, to go in and look with eyes open to the choices that we made and undo these choices, or delete the distortion from these choices, so that that time or part of our timeline that we are connected to on a main timeline can collapse, and by that assist to heal the main timeline that is part of our reality field. Our activation is not just about our own consciousness potentials. It is just as much the repairing of the reality field and the choices that were done by the different collectives that have been part of our solar system history. But more into this in the next podcast. Thank you.